Anderson, and I was 34 the day I buried the only person who ever truly raised me. His name was Walter Kessler, my grandfather, and he taught me how to sand a board and balance a checkbook and show up for people. At his funeral, 2 chairs in the front row stayed empty. The chairs I had saved for my parents, who never came. But what they posted online 3 hours later, and the text that arrived from my dead grandfather's phone, is where this story really begins. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. This is the channel where we sit with the quiet betrayals that happen inside families and the women who finally stop shrinking to keep the peace. If a story like this has ever lived in your own house, you already know how heavy a folded flag can feel. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. I remember standing at the front of that little chapel, watching the room fill with people who loved him. Neighbors, old customers, a man he'd taught to build a porch in 1994. Everyone showed up except the 2 people who shared his blood and my last name. And then, right there in the pew, my phone buzzed. I looked down, and the ground tilted under me. To understand that buzz, you have to understand the man in the box at the front of the room. My parents left when I was 7. Roy and Denise Anderson had places to be, apparently, and a little girl was a weight they set down like an old coat. So Walter took me in. He was 51 then, a retired carpenter with sawdust in the creases of his hands, and he did not sigh once. He just made up the spare room and bought a nightlight shaped like a moon. He came to every single thing. Every school play where I forgot my line, every softball game where I struck out looking, every parent-teacher night, sitting in a chair built for a child, his knees up near his ears, taking notes on a folded receipt. My mother sent a card on my birthday when she remembered the month. Walter never missed a day. When I was 9, I asked him why my parents didn't want me, and he set down his coffee and said something I carried my whole life. "Showing up is the whole thing, sweetheart." He said the rest is just noise. He said love isn't a speech, it's a person in a chair. And for 27 years, he was the person in the chair. He walked me down the aisle when I married Sam. He held my daughter Nora an hour after she was born and cried without shame. So no, I was not confused about who my family was, which is why, that last hard week of his life, when he needed me most, the thing that still keeps me up at night is that I got there late. The cancer came for his pancreas, which is the kind that doesn't negotiate. By spring, the chemo had hollowed him out. I drove the 20 minutes to his house every evening after I closed my books. I keep the ledgers for half the small businesses in town, so numbers are my whole trade. I'd make him toast he couldn't finish, and we'd watch the same westerns. That was when my mother reappeared. Denise, who lived in Florida and only ever surfaced when something could be spent, suddenly flew up to help Daddy. She took over his mail. She took over his bank. When I offered to sit down and organize his accounts, my actual profession, she smiled that tight smile and said, "Daddy wants his privacy, Colleen." I pushed. I asked to be added so I could watch for fraud, the way any accountant would. She said he'd set it up his way and it wasn't my place. And here is the part I keep turning over. I was suspicious. I asked the right questions. I even called his bank. And they told me only the account holder or his power of attorney could discuss it, and his power of attorney was Denise. There was a wall around him, and it had my mother's signature on it, and there was nothing I could legally reach across. I told myself she was his daughter. I told myself grief was making me paranoid. I brought him soup, and I kept my mouth shut, and I trusted the wrong thing. 3 weeks later, he was gone. And I still didn't know what she was hiding behind that tight little smile. He died on a Tuesday, at home, with me holding his hand and a nurse named Grace on the other side. Denise had flown back to Florida 4 days earlier because, and I am quoting, she couldn't just sit around waiting. So I planned the funeral alone. I picked the hymns. I wrote the obituary at my kitchen table at 2 a.m. while Sam slept. I called the church, the florist, the man who digs the graves. And then I called my mother to tell her the date. There was a pause and pool noises in the background, and she said they couldn't make it back in time. Flights were expensive. Daddy would understand. They'd say a prayer down there. I sat with the phone against my ear a long time after she hung up. I thought about Walter in his child-sized chair at every recital. I thought about the receipt he took notes on. Showing up is the whole thing, sweetheart. He'd said it so many times it lived in me like a heartbeat. And his own daughter couldn't find a flight. Something in me just went quiet, the way you do when a number won't reconcile no matter how many times you run it. I told myself 2 empty chairs at a funeral was the worst thing they could do to me. I told myself it couldn't get lower than a daughter skipping her father's grave. I was wrong about that. I was so wrong. The lowest thing was still 3 hours away, and it was already loaded and waiting on a beach in the Caribbean. The funeral was on a gray Saturday, the kind of morning where the sky can't decide to rain. I got there early and I saved 2 chairs in the front row. I don't know why. Hope is a stubborn animal. I set a folded program on each seat, and I waited for a daughter who wasn't coming. The chapel filled up behind me. I turned around once and my breath caught, because the room was packed. There was the Delgado family, whose fence he rebuilt for free after the flood. There was old Mr. Prentice, who cried into a handkerchief the size of a dish towel. There was a woman I didn't recognize who told me Walter taught her late husband his whole trade, and that they never forgot it. Half the town came for a retired carpenter. And 2 chairs in the front row stayed empty, with 2 little programs sitting on them like place cards for ghosts. The pastor spoke. Grace the nurse squeezed my shoulder. I stood up to read the words I'd written at 2 in the morning, and my voice held, because Walter's granddaughter does not fall apart in public. He raised me steadier than that. I sat back down. I looked at those 2 empty chairs one more time. And that was the exact moment my phone buzzed in my black coat pocket. I almost didn't look, but I did. It was a photo. My mother in a turquoise sarong, holding a drink with an umbrella in it, my father grinning behind her, sunburned and pleased. White sand. A blue that only exists in vacation brochures. And underneath, in her own cheerful hand, 4 words that I will hear for the rest of my life. Living our best life. Posted publicly. Time stamped 11 minutes into her father's funeral. My hand went cold around the phone. I don't remember the rest of the service. I remember the parking lot afterward, sitting behind the wheel of my car with the engine off, staring at that photo until the screen went dark and I turned it back on and stared again. Living our best life. Their best life. While I lowered their father into the ground. I have spent my whole career being calm about other people's disasters. A missing invoice, a blown budget, a client crying about a tax bill. I am the steady one, the one who says, let's look at the numbers. But sitting in that lot, I could not find a single steady thought. I kept doing the math on the timeline. She posted it 11 minutes in, which meant she'd been dressing for the beach, choosing the filter, thinking about her caption. At the exact hour she knew we'd be singing his favorite hymn. That was not forgetting. That was a decision. I was still holding the phone when it buzzed again in my hand. A text this time. From a contact saved in my phone under one word, Grandpa. His number. The number I'd called every night for months. The number that had gone quiet on Tuesday when a nurse named Grace pulled a sheet up and I stopped breathing for a while. And now it lit up my screen like nothing had happened. Sweetheart, come to my house right now. I read it 4 times. My grandfather was in the ground behind me. I had watched him die. There was no version of the world where that phone should be sending me anything. My skin went to goose flesh under the black wool. I looked back toward the cemetery, then down at his name glowing on my screen, and I did the only thing his granddaughter could do. I turned the key. Walter's house sat 20 minutes out of town on a road that turns to gravel at the mailbox. I made it in 15. The whole drive my hands wouldn't quite stop shaking, and I kept the radio off, and I told myself all the reasonable things. A wrong number. A glitch. Someone's cruel idea of a joke. But the porch light was on when I pulled up, and the front door stood open, and there was a car in the drive I half recognized. I went up the steps I'd painted with him the summer I turned 12. Inside, at his kitchen table, sat a heavy-set man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and Walter's phone in his hand. Harold Metz, Walter's lawyer for 30 years, and I think his last real friend. He stood up when he saw my face and said, "Colleen, I am so sorry. I should have called from my own number, but he told me you might not come for a stranger. He told me you'd come for him." I couldn't speak. Harold set the phone down gently, like it was still warm. "Your grandfather asked me to do this," he said. "Months ago. He made me promise that the day after he passed, I'd get you out here. Alone. No matter what it took. And he told me to use his phone, because he said, and I'm quoting him, 'She'll drop everything for that name.'" I looked at the phone. I looked at the empty chair at the head of the table. My heart didn't sink so much as fall straight through the floor. Because this wasn't a glitch or a ghost. This was Walter, reaching one more time from the far side of the worst week of my life, and it meant he'd known something was coming. Harold pushed his glasses down onto his nose. "There's a box," he said. "He wanted you to have it." The box was an old cigar box, the kind he kept screws in, and it had my name on the lid in his shaky block letters. Inside were 3 things: a journal with a soft blue cover, worn at the corners, a thick stack of bank statements, photocopied and paper-clipped by month, and a folder holding a copy of a legal document I recognized before I could read the title, because I filed 100 of them. A durable power of attorney, Denise's name on the signature line. I looked up at Harold. He folded his hands. "Your grandfather didn't trust his daughter," he said quietly. "Not at the end. He wanted you to have the truth, Colleen, not just the grief. He said you were the only one who'd know what to do with numbers, and the only one who ever showed up." I ran my thumb over the blue cover of the journal. I could feel the ridges where a shaking hand had pressed too hard. I did not open it yet. I wasn't ready, but I understood, holding that box, that my life had just split into a before and an after, and there was no gluing it back. If you've ever been handed grief and paperwork in the very same breath, you know how loud a quiet kitchen can get. Stay with me, because this is the moment I stopped being the girl who just kept the peace. Comment, "Showing up," if there's someone in your life who always did. And subscribe, because what I found in those pages is the reason my mother is where she is today. I put the lid back on the box. I thanked Harold, and I drove the blue journal home like it was a live thing on the seat beside me. Sam was up when I got home, Nora finally asleep, the porch light on for me the way Walter always left it. He took one look at the box and my face and put the kettle on without a word. He's a good man, my husband, an electrician who fixes things for a living and wants the world to be fixable too. I told him about the beach photo. I told him about the text from a dead man's phone. He sat down slow. Then I opened the journal. Walter's handwriting had always been square and sure, a carpenter's hand. But these pages started strong and got worse. Line by line, the letters loosening as the chemo took his grip. The early entries were just a sick man's diary. Bad night. Grace changed the dressing. Colleen brought soup, stayed for the Western. Then, a few weeks in, the tone changed. "Money's tight again," he wrote, "and I don't know why. Denise says I spent it. Maybe I did. I get so tired I can't remember." I read that line 3 times. My grandfather never lost track of a nickel in his life. He kept receipts in a shoebox by decade. And here he was, in his own failing hand, wondering aloud where his savings had gone, while his daughter told him he'd simply spent it. Sam read over my shoulder and went very still. The kettle screamed, and neither of us moved. Somewhere in these pages I already knew was the shape of the thing that had built a wall around a dying man. I turned to the next entry. My hands were steadier now. Numbers are the one place I never lose my nerve, and Walter, God bless him, had started keeping his own. The middle of the journal was where a scared old man turned into a careful one. After that first chemo round, Walter wrote, Denise had sat him down and said his mind wasn't safe anymore, that he needed help managing things, that she'd take the burden off him. So he'd signed. the durable power of attorney, right there at his own table, the day after a treatment that left him too weak to lift a spoon. She'd brought the papers pre-filled. He signed because she was his daughter, and he was frightened and tired, and because a father wants to believe his child is reaching out a hand and not into a pocket. Then the entries started listing amounts. 400 out on the 9th, he wrote. Didn't buy anything. 600 on the 15th. Grace drove me to the pharmacy. $40. That's all I spent all week. He'd begun to notice the gaps. He'd begun, in his weakest months, to keep a private tally, because some part of the man who never lost a nickel knew exactly what he was watching. She thinks I'm too far gone to count, he wrote near the bottom of one page. I'm not. I just can't stop her. The bank won't talk to me. They talk to her. And under that, pressed so hard the pen nearly tore the paper. I gave her the key to the house, and she took the house. Not the building. Everything else. I set the journal down and looked at the stack of statements he'd photocopied. He'd left me a map. All I had to do was follow it, month by month, the one thing in this whole nightmare I actually knew how to do. I spread the statements across the dining table the way I do for a client audit, oldest to newest, and I started reconciling. This is the part of my job most people find boring. I find it honest. Numbers don't have a side. They don't love you or lie to you. They just sit there and tell you what happened. And what happened to Walter Kessler was written in plain black ink, transfer by transfer. Starting the month after the power of attorney was signed, money began leaving his savings in steady bites. Not medical bills. I cross-checked every hospital and pharmacy charge, and those were small and separate. These were transfers. Electronic, clean, regular, moving from his account into an account ending in the same 4 digits over and over. Some months, 3,000. Some months, 11. A loan here. A reimbursement there. Though I could not find one thing she'd ever bought him. A man dying by inches. And every few weeks, his own savings walked out the door toward Florida. I built a spreadsheet, the way I've built 10,000 of them, and I watched the running total climb up the right-hand column like a fever chart. Sam brought me coffee at midnight and didn't say anything. He knows the look I get when the numbers start telling a story. Around 1 a.m, I sat back and pressed my hands flat on the table to stop them shaking. Because grief makes you doubt yourself. Grief makes you wonder if you're twisting things, if you're the crazy one. But numbers don't grieve. They just tell the truth. And the truth was climbing that column faster than I wanted it to. Before I did anything drastic, I called her. I owe myself that much to say out loud. I gave my mother a chance to explain. I sat in my car the next morning because I didn't want Nora in the house for it, and I dialed Florida. Denise answered bright and breezy, still riding the tan. I kept my voice level. I told her I'd been going through Grandpa's papers, that there were some withdrawals I couldn't account for, and I asked, plainly, what the transfers to her account were for. The warmth dropped out of her voice like a trapdoor opening. That is none of your business, she said. I said it was, because I was the one settling his affairs. She laughed, and it was an ugly sound. His affairs, she said. His affairs are family business. And last I checked, you're not really family, are you? I said nothing. I let her keep going, the way you let a client dig their own hole in an audit. He felt sorry for you, she said. That's all it ever was. You want to know the truth, Colleen. You were his charity case, not his blood. His blood is me, and what's mine is mine. And then she hung up on me. I sat in the driveway with the phone in my lap for a long time. Charity case, not his blood. She'd handed me the exact sentence she thought would break me, the one designed to make me sit down and stay small and grateful. 20 years ago, it would have worked. But I wasn't 9 anymore, and I had a spreadsheet in the house that didn't care whose blood it was. I went back inside and picked up his journal. I called Harold and asked him to explain the power of attorney to me like I was a jury, not an accountant. He met me at his office, a cluttered little place above the hardware store, and he laid it out straight. A durable power of attorney, he said, doesn't make you an owner. It makes you a fiduciary. That's the whole point. She was legally required to act in his interest, not hers. Every dollar she moved had to be for Walter. His care, his bills, his comfort. She could not lend it to herself, gift it to herself, or reimburse herself for things she never bought. Doing that isn't a family disagreement, Colleen. That's a breach of fiduciary duty. And past a certain dollar amount, taking from an elder like that has a name the state takes very seriously. I asked him what I could do. He rubbed his eyes. You can petition the probate court for a formal accounting, he said. That forces her to open the books and justify every transfer, in writing, under oath, within 30 days. If she can't, and from what you're telling me, she can't, that failure becomes evidence. Then it's not just civil. Then it can go to the prosecutor. He looked at me over his glasses and his voice softened. But I want you to hear the rest of it. This is your mother. You start this. And there is no quiet way to finish it. You could send her to prison. Family doesn't come back from that. I thanked him and drove home with the whole shape of it finally clear. There was a legal road. It ran straight through my mother, and I hadn't decided yet whether I could walk it. That night I couldn't sleep, so I went back to the journal, further than I'd read before, into the last entries where his handwriting barely held together. And near the end, pressed between 2 pages, I found a folded scrap of paper. It was a page torn from his prescription pad. On it, in that failing carpenter's hand, he'd written 4 account numbers: his savings, his checking, a CD, and one I didn't recognize. And beneath them, one line. If you're reading this, sweetheart, then I was right about them. And I'm sorry. I sat on the edge of the bed and read it until the words blurred. He'd known. That was the thing that undid me, more than the photo, more than the empty chairs. He had known what his daughter was doing to him, and he had been too weak and too walled off to stop it. And instead of giving up, he had quietly built a case in a cigar box and handed it to the one grandchild he trusted. He'd torn a page from a prescription pad, a dying man's most useless paper, and turned it into a key. And the sorry. That sorry sat on my chest like a stone. He was apologizing to me, as if being betrayed by his own daughter was somehow a thing he'd done to me, rather than a thing done to us both. I pressed the scrap flat, and I understood exactly what he'd left me and why. He hadn't left me grief. He'd left me instructions. 4 account numbers and a line that said I was right about them, from a man who was never wrong about people. I put the note where I'd never lose it, and somewhere between that line and the sunrise, without deciding it out loud, I stopped grieving quite so much and started counting. Because he'd been keeping his own numbers for a reason. Now I was going to finish them. With the 4th account number from his note, I finally had the whole picture, because that last unfamiliar account was a certificate of deposit he'd built over 40 years. His real nest egg, the one he'd meant to leave to something good. I pulled the records Harold could legally request, and I added the CD to my spreadsheet, and I watched the running total jump. She hadn't just skimmed his monthly savings. Somewhere in his weakest month, while he was too sick to sign his own name steady, she'd used the power of attorney to cash out the certificate early, eaten the penalty, and moved the whole thing south. I ran the total 3 times because I did not believe it the first 2. $465,000. That was the number sitting at the bottom of my column. $465,000, drained out of a man who ate toast he couldn't finish and wore the same flannel shirt for 15 years because a good shirt shouldn't be wasted. I thought about him at his kitchen table, writing 400 out on the 9th. Didn't buy anything, apologizing in his diary for spending money he never spent. And the whole time, nearly $500,000 was walking out the door behind his back. I closed the laptop very gently, because if I hadn't closed it gently, I would have thrown it. I sat in the dark dining room and let the number settle into me. It didn't make me hysterical. It made me certain. There was still one thing I needed. The final confirmation that would turn my private spreadsheet into something a court would have to look at. And I knew exactly where to get it. The first person to call me was my Uncle Dave, Denise's younger brother, and I made the mistake of thinking he'd be on my side. He'd always been the softer one, the uncle who slipped me a $5 at Christmas. He started gentle. He'd heard I was upset about some money. He understood. He really did. But did I really want to tear the family apart over Daddy's estate? I told him it wasn't the estate. I told him she'd drained Walter's accounts while the man was dying, $465,000, and I had the records. There was a silence on the line, and I could hear him recalculating, and it wasn't sympathy he was doing the math on. "Look, Colleen," he said finally, his voice thinner now. "Whatever happened, it stays in the family. You go to a court, you drag lawyers in, there's nothing left for anybody. Denise says there's supposed to be a share for me and your aunt too. Don't blow that up." And there it was. He wasn't afraid for Walter. He was afraid for his cut. He was standing in a burning house asking me not to call the fire department in case the water damaged his half. I told him I loved him, and I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. That was the first one to go. My own uncle, choosing a payout over the truth, choosing his sister's silence over his father's stolen savings. I stood at my window and understood something cold and clean. This wasn't going to be me against my mother. This was going to be me against everyone who wanted a piece and was willing to call betrayal family business to get it. I was already more alone than I'd been an hour before. The one I didn't see coming was Sam. He waited until Nora was in bed, and he sat down across from my spreadsheets with his hands wrapped around a mug he wasn't drinking from, and he said the thing carefully, the way you handle a live wire. "Call," he said. "I love you, and I loved Walter. But maybe we let this one go." I stared at him. He kept going, gentle and reasonable and wrong. "It's not our money," he said. "It never was. You go to war with your mother, and it's lawyers, and it's years, and it's Nora watching her mama tear herself up over a dead man's bank account. He can't spend it now. Let's protect what we've got and walk away." I know he wasn't being cruel. He was being a father, standing between his family and a fire. But it landed like a betrayal anyway, because it meant the one person I thought would stand beside me was asking me to sit down. "It's not about the money," I told him. "It was never about the money, Sam. It's about a man who came to every single thing I ever did, and his daughter couldn't come to his funeral because she was too busy spending what she stole from him. If I let that go, then showing up means nothing. Then love is just whatever people say when the will gets read." He looked at me a long time. He didn't agree. Not that night. He went to bed, and I stayed at the table alone with my grandfather's journal and $500,000 in stolen numbers and no one, not one single person, standing with me. And that was when I finally understood what I was going to have to do. She moved faster than I expected. A week after our phone call, I drove out to Walter's house. I don't know why, maybe just to sit on the porch we painted, and there was a realtor's sign hammered into the front yard and a lockbox on the door. She'd flown up, changed the locks, and put his house on the market before the flowers on his grave had wilted. I stood in the gravel drive where I'd parked 100 times and I couldn't get in. My grandfather's house, the only place on earth that ever felt like home to me, and I was locked out of it by my own mother selling it out from under him. There was a light on inside. I could see her moving behind the curtains, boxing up his life, and when she saw my car, she came to the window and pulled the curtain shut. Didn't open the door. Didn't say a word. Just closed the curtain on me like I was a solicitor. I stood there in the cold until the porch light he always left on for me clicked off. She turned off his light. That's the detail I can't shake. For 27 years that light was on for me when I came up the drive, and my mother reached over and turned it off. I drove home with my jaw so tight it ached. She was going to sell the house, pocket the money, salt the earth, and dare anyone to say a word, because who takes their own mother to court? She was betting everything on the one thing that had kept me small my whole life. She was betting I'd stay quiet to keep the peace. She bet wrong. When quiet threats didn't move me, she tried a loud one. Denise called. The first time she'd called me in weeks. and her voice had that rehearsed calm people use when a lawyer has coached them. She'd heard I was talking to attorneys. She wanted me to understand something. If I came after her, she said, she would tell everyone the truth. That I was the one who'd manipulated a dying, confused old man. That I'd wormed my way into his house, poisoned him against his own daughter, and cooked up these accusations to steal an inheritance I had no blood right to. She said it so smoothly I knew she'd said it out loud before, practicing. "You have no idea how this looks, Colleen," she said. "The charity case grandchild, all alone with the sick man, controlling his money. You throw 1 stone, I throw 10. She was flipping it. In her version, the thief was the victim, and the granddaughter who showed up every night was the vulture. And the awful thing is, I understood it might work on people who didn't know us. A jury doesn't see 27 years of recitals. They see a will and a woman and a lot of missing money, and they wonder. For about an hour after that call, I was genuinely afraid. Not of her. Of the story she could tell. Then I remembered what I actually had. Not a story. Not a he said. I had Walter's own handwriting, dated in his own failing hand, writing down what she was doing to him while she was doing it. I had a fiduciary who couldn't account for a nickel. I had numbers that don't grieve. Let her throw 10 stones. I had the one that was true. Harold sent me to a woman named Patricia Ruiz, who did nothing but elder law, and she was the first person in weeks who looked at my spreadsheet and didn't flinch. She spread Walter's journal, the statements, and the power of attorney across her desk and read for 20 minutes without a word. Then she took off her glasses. "Mrs. Anderson," she said, "in my experience, most of these cases are a fog. Somebody's confused, records are gone, it's one memory against another. This is not that. Your grandfather did your work for you. He documented his own exploitation in real time and left you a paper trail." She explained the road, plainly. First, a petition for a judicial accounting. The probate court orders Denise to justify every transfer under oath within 30 days. When she can't, that's a breach of her fiduciary duty, and it's civil, meaning restitution, and because she acted in bad faith, potentially double the amount taken. But past a threshold, and $465,000 is well past it, she said. This stops being a family lawsuit and becomes financial exploitation of an elder. That's a felony. That's a prosecutor, and a criminal record, and possibly prison. She set down her pen and looked at me the way Harold had. "You need to decide something before we file," she said, "because a judge can't unring this bell, and neither can you. Once I petition, your mother is on a track that ends in handcuffs if the evidence holds, and your evidence holds." I sat in that chair a long moment. Everything I'd feared and everything I'd wanted were finally the same object on her desk. The road was real. It was paved. And every single mile of it ran straight over my mother. I told Patricia I needed a night, and I meant it. That night was the hardest of the whole thing, harder than the funeral, because at the funeral there was nothing to decide. This I had to choose. I sat at my dining table and let myself feel the full weight of it. If I signed her papers, my mother, the woman whose face I'd searched for at every recital and never found, would become a criminal defendant. She could go to prison. Whatever thread still connected us, thin and mean as it was, would be cut for good, and I would be the one holding the scissors. There is a version of me, the 9-year-old version, who would have set the pen down and made peace, and spent the rest of her life being grateful for scraps. And I sat there, and I felt her pulling at me, that small girl who believed if she was just good enough and quiet enough, her mother might finally love her. Keep the peace. Don't make trouble. Earn it. And then I opened Walter's journal to the line I'd read 100 times, the line he'd said to a crying 9-year-old and written to a grieving woman. "Showing up is the whole thing, sweetheart." And I finally understood I'd had it backwards my entire life. I thought showing up meant sitting in the chair no matter what, taking it, staying, keeping the peace. But Walter never once kept the peace with the truth. He showed up for me. which meant he stood between me and the people who'd hurt me. Showing up isn't shrinking, it's standing. He'd spent his last strength standing up for me from inside a cigar box. The very least I could do was stand up for him out loud. I closed the journal. I put the 9-year-old to bed, gently, for the last time. And in the morning, I called Patricia and told her to file. We filed on a Thursday. I remember because I took the morning off work and sat in Patricia's office while she walked me through each signature, and every one of them felt like closing a door I could never open again. The petition for a judicial accounting, demanding Denise justify every transfer under oath. The report to Adult Protective Services documenting the financial exploitation of Walter Kessler, and an affidavit. My sworn statement. My name at the bottom, testifying against my own mother. Patricia slid each page across and I signed, steady, the carpenter's granddaughter with the accountant's hand, and I did not let it shake. When it was done, she gathered the papers into a folder and said quietly, "You understand there's no undo now. Once this is in front of the court, it belongs to the court, not to you. If they take it criminal, you can't call it off." I said I understood. I did understand. I understood that I had just, with my own hand, ended whatever family I had left, and that the 2 empty chairs at the funeral had only been the beginning. I understood that my uncle would never speak to me again, and my aunt, and half the people I grew up around. I understood I was choosing a dead man over a living one, over a whole living family, and that most people would call me cold for it. I drove home terrified, genuinely, physically terrified, hands wet on the wheel. But underneath the terror was something I hadn't felt in 27 years, and it took me a while to name it. It was relief. The specific relief of a woman who has finally stopped auditioning for love she was never going to be given, and started standing on solid ground instead. The papers were filed. The bell was rung. And somewhere in Florida, a certified letter was already on its way to a woman who thought her granddaughter would always, always stay quiet. The letter reached her on a Monday, and she called me that same night, and I let it go to voicemail, and then I made myself listen to it. The first 2 minutes were rage. She called me a viper, a liar, a nobody who crawled in off the street and turned on the family that took her in. She said I had always been jealous, always been grasping, that Walter should have left me on the porch where he found me. I stood in my kitchen and let it wash over me, and it didn't cut the way Charity Case had cut. Somewhere along this road her words had lost their edge on me. Then, mid-sentence, the recording changed. Her voice went soft, wet, pleading, the fastest hairpin turn you've ever heard. "Sweetheart," she said. She hadn't called me sweetheart in my life. That was his word, and hearing it in her mouth turned my stomach. "Sweetheart, please, we can fix this. Family stays together. Drop the case and you'll still have a mother. Think about Nora. Doesn't your little girl deserve a grandmother?" And there it was, the oldest hook in the world, the exact bait that would have caught me at any earlier point in my life. "You'll still have a mother," as if she'd ever once been one. As if the word were a gift she was offering instead of a debt she'd never paid. I deleted the voicemail. I did not call back. I understood, finally and completely, that she wasn't sorry. She was cornered, and to a woman like Denise, those feel identical. She would say anything to make the numbers go away. But the numbers weren't hers to make go away anymore. They belonged to a judge now. And the judge was going to want them explained. The 30 days ran out, and Denise's accounting came back to the court exactly as Patricia predicted. Thin, defensive, and full of holes. She'd listed the transfers as caregiver reimbursements and family loans, with no receipts, no signed agreements, no proof Walter had ever agreed to a dime of it. For a fiduciary, that's not an explanation. That's a confession with better handwriting. In the weeks before the hearing, Patricia and Harold and I built the file. We laid Walter's journal beside the bank statements and matched his shaky handwritten notes to the actual transfers, date for date. 400 out on the 9th. There it was on the statement. 400, transferred to Florida on the 9th. 600 on the 15th. There it was. He hadn't just left me grief and a hunch. He'd left me a witness statement in his own hand that the bank records confirmed line by line. We built a simple exhibit. His words on the left, the numbers on the right, and the running total climbing to $465,000 at the bottom. Patricia looked at the finished thing and said she'd been practicing 30 years and rarely seen a cleaner case. I should have felt triumphant. Mostly, I felt tired and sad and steady. The night before the hearing, I laid out my clothes and I read Walter's last line one more time. If you're reading this, sweetheart, then I was right about them. And I'm sorry. Then I turned off the light. Tomorrow I would sit in a courtroom across from my mother and let the numbers he'd kept do the talking. I'd stopped rehearsing what to say to her weeks ago. The whole point was that I no longer needed her to hear me. The probate courtroom was small and paneled in the kind of wood Walter would have run his hand along to check the grain. I sat at the table on the left with Patricia. Harold sat behind us. And behind him, in the gallery, were the relatives. My Uncle Dave, who wouldn't meet my eyes, my aunt, a cousin or two, all of them there to watch, and none of them beside me. Then Denise and Roy came in, and I almost laughed at the sight of them, because they'd dressed for it. She wore a cream suit and pearls, her tan gone gold under the fluorescent lights, and she walked in like a woman attending someone else's misfortune. Roy trailed behind her, sunburned still, in a blazer that didn't fit. They had a lawyer in an expensive tie, and the three of them settled in with the confidence of people who had never once been told no. The judge called it to order. Patricia presented the petition. And then Denise's lawyer stood and did what he'd been hired to do, which was to make $465,000 sound like a misunderstanding between loving relatives. He talked about a grieving family, a difficult illness, informal arrangements, the messiness of caring for a dying parent. He was good. He was smooth. And the whole time he talked, the judge kept glancing down at the exhibit in front of him. Walter's shaking handwriting on the left, the bank's cold confirmation on the right. And I watched the judge's face, and I knew the tie and the tan weren't going to be enough, because you cannot smooth talk a running total. You cannot charm a spreadsheet. Denise had built her whole life on the belief that a confident voice could rewrite any number. And she was about to sit in a room where, for once, the numbers got to speak last. The judge called a short recess before ruling, and that's when they made their move. Denise's lawyer caught Patricia in the hallway and asked for a moment with just me. Against her better judgment, Patricia let me hear it, standing right beside me the whole time. The offer was surgical. Denise would return a portion of the money, not all, a portion. And, this was the sweetener, she would sign Walter's house back over to me. My house, the porch, the moon nightlight, the light she'd turned off. In exchange, I would withdraw the criminal referral, drop the affidavit, and sign a confidentiality agreement. Keep it in the family. No prosecutor. No record. And then, Denise herself stepped into the hallway, because she couldn't help it, and she softened her whole face and reached for my hand and said the line she'd clearly saved. "Take the house, sweetheart. Let's put this behind us. You'll still have a mother." And I stood there and felt the exact shape of the trap, because it was built out of everything I'd ever wanted. The house. Peace. A mother. Even a terrible one. Instead of no one. Everything 9-year-old me had prayed for, offered on a hallway floor in exchange for one small thing. My silence. All I had to do was be quiet, take the gift, and let her walk. Keep the peace. The thing I'd done my whole life. I looked at my mother's outstretched hand. I looked at Patricia, who said nothing, who let it be mine. And I felt, very clearly, two futures pulling at me. The warm, quiet one where I got my house and swallowed the truth, and the cold, clean one where I lost everything and kept my word to a dead man. My grandfather came to every single thing. The least I could do was not sell him out in a hallway for a set of keys. I took my hand back. "No," I said. "Just the one word, quiet. the way he taught me to say the important things. My mother's face went blank, then furious, because in her whole life, no one had ever handed her a house and gotten a no. We went back into the courtroom, and when Patricia offered the exhibits into the record, I asked if I could speak, and the judge allowed it. I did not raise my voice. I didn't have to. I stood up, and I laid it out the way I lay out an audit for a client. Plainly, in order, no heat. I read Walter's own words first. Money's tight and I don't know why. She thinks I'm too far gone to count. I'm not. I just can't stop her. Then I matched each line to the bank's confirmation, transfer by transfer, up to the certificate of deposit she cashed out while he was too sick to sign steady, all the way to $465,000. I told the court that this money was never mine to want, and I wasn't there to claim it. I told them my grandfather had meant that CD for something good, and that I was asking the court to see it returned so it could go to elderly people with no one to show up for them. Not to me, not to his house, which I would be giving to an elder care charity in his name. And it was that, oddly, that broke Denise. Not the numbers, the part where I gave it all away. She shot to her feet, and it came out of her before her lawyer could catch her sleeve. "It was owed to me," she shouted at the whole room. "It was mine. I earned it. I put up with that old man my whole life." The courtroom went silent. She'd said it in front of a judge, and I just looked at her, calm, steady, done. And I understood I'd won and lost the exact same thing in the exact same breath. I had my grandfather's honor, and I would never have a mother again. Both at once. That's the price. Nobody tells you it comes as one bill. The judge did not need long. He found that Denise had breached her fiduciary duty in the plainest terms he'd seen, that the transfers served her and not the man she was sworn to protect, and that her own outburst had spared everyone the trouble of proving intent. He ordered full restitution of the $465,000, and because he found she'd acted in bad faith, he doubled it in damages. Then he did the thing that could not be undone. He referred the matter to the county prosecutor for criminal charges, financial exploitation of an elder, a felony. I watched it land on her. I watched the cream suit and the gold tan stop meaning anything at all. Roy, my father, who had ridden her coattails to that Caribbean beach, leaned away from her in his ill-fitting blazer, already calculating how to save himself, and I knew he'd flip the second a prosecutor offered him a deal. He always did travel light. Denise looked at me across that little courtroom, and for 1 second the mask dropped, and I saw something almost human under it. Not remorse. I don't think she has it. But fear. Real fear. The fear of a woman who spent her life certain that confidence could rewrite any number and had just learned it couldn't. I didn't gloat. There was nothing to gloat about. I looked past her instead, to the empty chair at the end of our table where Harold had set Walter's blue journal, and I said it under my breath. Just for him. Numbers don't grieve. They just tell the truth. He'd kept his own numbers to the very end in a shaking hand, so that one day this room would have to listen to them. And it had. The whole town had skipped nothing. Half of it filled his funeral, and now a courtroom had heard his final words read out loud. The man who always showed up had, in the end, gotten one last day in court. I made sure of it. She found me on the courthouse steps afterward, because she couldn't let it end without the last word she'd always taken. Roy was already gone, off to find his own lawyer. Denise came at me with her voice low and shaking, all pretense burned off now. "I hope you're happy," she hissed. "You destroyed this family. You took everything from me. You were never even one of us." And I stood there on those steps in the gray afternoon, and I felt, for the first time in 34 years, absolutely nothing she could reach. No fear, no hunger for her approval, no 9-year-old waiting to be chosen. I looked at my mother and I said the only thing left that was true. "I didn't take anything from you," I said. "You took it from him." I just wrote it down. Then I told her, without heat, that I wouldn't be speaking with her again, that she was not to contact me or Nora, and that if she did, my lawyer would handle it. I set the boundary the way you'd close a ledger that finally balances. Cleanly, quietly, done. She opened her mouth to fire back, and there was nothing to fire at. So she just stood there. And for once in her life, Denise Anderson had no line ready. I walked down the steps and I did not look back at her. And the strange thing was how light I felt. Not happy. You don't get happy at the end of something like this. But free. Free of a debt I'd been trying to pay my whole life to a woman who was never going to mark it settled. I got in my car. Sam was waiting at home. And I drove toward the people who actually show up. The rest came in the slow, unglamorous way real justice usually does. Denise took a plea rather than risk a jury and served time for felony exploitation, with restitution ordered on top. Roy flipped, exactly as I knew he would, testified against her, and walked away with probation and a reputation nobody in that town would ever forget. My Uncle Dave got his silence, and it cost him a niece. We haven't spoken since, and I've made my peace with that too. The doubled restitution came through in pieces over the following year, and I did not keep $1 of it. Every cent, plus the sale of the certificate of deposit, went into a small fund I set up in his name, the Walter Kessler Fund, for elderly people with no family left to show up for them. It pays for rides to chemo. It pays for someone to sit in the chair. And his house, the one she tried to sell out from under him, I signed over to an elder care charity, so that the place where a lonely little girl once got a moon nightlight would go on sheltering people no one else came for. My mother once told me I was his charity case, not his blood. She meant it as the cruelest thing she could say. I think about it now every time I sign a check from that fund, and I have to smile, because she was almost right. I was raised by charity, the real kind, the kind that shows up and stays. And I grew up to run some. On the day we handed the house over to the charity, I took Sam and Nora out there one last time. Sam had come around long before the hearing ended. He told me later that watching me refuse that house in a hallway was the moment he understood he'd married someone with a spine made of the same oak as her grandfather. He held my hand on the porch we painted. Nora, 6 and fearless, ran the length of the yard the way I used to, and the porch light was on, because I'd driven out the week before and put a new bulb in it and left it burning. We sat on the top step, the 3 of us, and I opened Walter's blue journal to the last page, and I read my daughter the final line her great-grandfather ever wrote. If you're reading this, sweetheart, then I was right about them, and I'm sorry. Nora asked me who he was sorry to, and I told her the truth. He was sorry the people who were supposed to love him didn't show up. Then I closed the journal and told her the other truth, the bigger one. That one person did show up, her whole life, and that his showing up was the reason her mama knew how to stand. Nora didn't fully understand. She's 6. But she'll have the journal one day, and she'll understand then. Here is the only thing I know for sure now. Love is not what people say when the will is read. It is not a caption on a beach or a card that comes the month your birthday falls in. Love is who is sitting in the chair when no one is watching and nothing is owed. My grandfather sat in that chair my whole life, and in the end, all I had to do, the only thing he ever asked of me, was show up for him the way he showed up for me. Showing up is the whole thing. 2 empty chairs, a photo from a beach, a blue journal in a cigar box. That's what betrayal looked like in my family, and standing up to it is what finally set me free. If someone in your life has always shown up for you, go tell them today, before the chairs are empty. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Calm Drama Stories and stay with us. There are more women here who stopped shrinking. Maybe the next one is you.